August 16, 1975. Behind the wheel is a clean-cut law student named Ted Bundy, cruising through a residential Salt Lake City suburb in the pre-dawn hours. He's alone, driving slowly, deliberately, scanning. However, what he doesn't know is that Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward has been watching him. Hayward notices something off about this car, about this driver, and when Bundy spots the patrol cruiser, he does something that will change everything. He turns off his headlights and speeds through stop signs, desperately trying to escape. Moments later, Hayward gives chase through the darkened streets. Bundy weaves erratically, running every stop sign, but it's no use. The sergeant finally forces him to pull over. When Hayward approaches the vehicle and peers inside, he sees handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, and pantyhose with eye holes cut out. The passenger seat has been removed entirely. This traffic stop would become the beginning of the end for America's most infamous serial killer.
He is one of America's most notorious serial killers, Ted Bundy.
This is a serial killer in front of you, unlike any we'd ever known in our time.
Absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
I think he stands out.
February 15, 1978, Pensacola, Florida. Officer David Lee pulls over a Volkswagen Beetle for a routine traffic violation near the Alabama state line. The car is stolen, but Lee doesn't know that yet. What he does know is that the driver seems nervous. Too nervous. When Lee tells the man he's under arrest, everything happens at once. The driver kicks Lee's legs out from under him and bolts into the darkness. Lee fires 2 warning shots before giving chase, finally tackling the fugitive to the ground. The 2 men struggle violently over Lee's gun until the officer finally subdues him. Inside the stolen vehicle, Lee discovers 3 sets of IDs belonging to female FSU students, 21 stolen credit cards, and a stolen television set. He has no idea he's just arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives. As Lee drives his suspect to jail, he hears something chilling from the back seat. "I wish you had killed me." The man's name is Ted Bundy, and by the time of this arrest, he's already murdered at least 30 women across 7 states, including 2 sorority sisters and a 12-year-old girl just weeks earlier. This arrest would be his last, but the story of how Ted Bundy became a monster and how law enforcement finally caught him begins years before this moment in Pensacola. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont, to an unwed mother named Eleanor Louise Cowell. The circumstances of his birth were shrouded in shame and deception from the very beginning. For the first 3 years of his life, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was actually his older sister, a lie designed to hide the social stigma of illegitimacy in 1940s America. The identity of Ted's biological father has never been confirmed. His original birth certificate listed a salesman and Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall, though a copy later showed his father as unknown. His mother claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington, who abandoned her after she became pregnant. Some family members even suspected Ted's grandfather, Samuel Cowell, might have been his father, though a 2020 DNA test ruled out incest. What is certain is that Ted eventually discovered the truth about his parentage, and the revelation left him with a lifelong resentment toward his mother. I expressed a lifelong resentment toward my mother for never telling me about my real father, and for leaving me to discover the truth about my paternity for myself, he would later confess. In 1950, Eleanor moved with young Ted to Tacoma, Washington, where she met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, a hospital cook. Johnny formally adopted Ted and gave him his last name. The couple would have 4 more children together, but Ted remained emotionally distant from his stepfather, later complaining to a girlfriend that Johnny wasn't very bright and didn't make much money. Family members would later paint a disturbing picture of Ted's early childhood. His Aunt Julia recalled waking from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, with 3-year-old Ted standing by her bed, smiling. A childhood neighbor, Sandy Holt, remembered Ted as a mean-spirited kid who liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. According to Holt, Ted once hanged a stray cat from a clothesline and set it on fire with lighter fluid. He would take younger children into the woods, force them to strip, and terrorize them so badly that you'd hear them screaming for blocks. Ted also built makeshift bungee traps around his neighborhood, injuring at least one girl. These weren't the impulsive acts of a troubled child. They were calculated, deliberate acts of cruelty that revealed something fundamentally broken inside him. But to the outside world, Ted Bundy appeared normal, even exceptional. At Woodrow Wilson High School, classmates described him as well-known and well-liked, a stark contrast to the sadistic child his family had witnessed. He was intelligent, articulate, and increasingly handsome as he entered his teenage years. Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington to study Chinese. In 1967, he met a woman who would forever change the trajectory of his life. A UW classmate identified in most accounts by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks, though her real name was Diane Edwards. Edwards was everything Bundy aspired to be: sophisticated, worldly, and from a wealthy family. Bundy would later describe her as the only woman I ever really loved. Their relationship lasted through his college years, but in early 1968, Edwards broke up with him, frustrated by what she called his immaturity and lack of ambition. The breakup devastated Bundy. Psychologist Dorothy Otnow Lewis would later identify this rejection as probably the pivotal time in his development. After Edwards left him, Bundy dropped out of college and drifted aimlessly. He traveled to Colorado, then east to Arkansas and Philadelphia, enrolling for 1 semester at Temple University. During this period, he frequently visited New York City, where he immersed himself in violent pornographic literature. Bundy returned to Washington in the fall of 1969. Now more focused and goal-oriented, he re-enrolled at UW as a psychology major and became an honor student. In 1970, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, where he met former Seattle police officer Ann Rule, who was working on becoming a crime writer. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time, describing him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. That same year, Bundy met Elizabeth Klupfer, a single mother working as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. They began dating, and Bundy became a father figure to her 3-year-old daughter, Molly. Their relationship would continue for years, even as Bundy's dark urges intensified. By 1972, Bundy had graduated from UW with honors and joined Governor Daniel Evans's re-election campaign. He was hired by the Washington State Republican Party, where his boss described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. Despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into law school at both the University of Puget Sound and the University of Utah, based on glowing letters of recommendation. To everyone who knew him, Ted Bundy was on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. But behind the charming facade, something monstrous was growing. In 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Diane Edwards during a trip to California on Republican Party business. She was amazed by his transformation. He was now a serious, dedicated professional, seemingly destined for greatness. They discussed marriage, and Bundy introduced her to colleagues as his fiancée. Then, in January 1974, Bundy did something that revealed the true depth of his pathology. He abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. When she finally reached him by phone a month later and demanded to know why he'd ended their relationship without explanation, he replied in a flat, calm voice,
"Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up.
Edwards concluded in retrospect that Ted's high-powered courtship in the latter part of 1973 had been deliberately planned, that he had waited all those years to be in a position where he could make her fall in love with him so that he could drop her, reject her, as she had rejected him. It was the ultimate act of emotional manipulation and revenge. But for Ted Bundy, emotional cruelty would no longer be enough. For Ted Bundy, emotional cruelty would no longer satisfy the darkness growing inside him. By late 1973, the darkness had fully consumed him. The rejection from Diane Edwards, the woman he'd orchestrated an elaborate scheme to hurt, marked a turning point. He'd proven he could manipulate and destroy emotionally. Now he wanted more. He wanted complete control, complete possession. And by January 1974, Ted Bundy would cross a line from which there was no return. The monster wasn't coming. The monster had arrived. August 16, 1975, a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah, just after 2 a.m. Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was cruising through a quiet Salt Lake City suburb when he noticed a tan Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly, deliberately through the darkness. The car's movement seemed off, scanning, hunting. When the driver spotted Hayward's patrol cruiser, something remarkable happened. The Beetle's headlights went dark. The car accelerated through stop signs, weaving erratically through residential streets in a desperate attempt to escape. Hayward gave chase. When he finally forced the Volkswagen to pull over, the driver seemed calm, almost eerily composed. He identified himself as Ted Bundy, a law student. "Just lost," he explained. "Nothing to worry about." But Hayward's instincts screamed otherwise. He searched the vehicle. Inside the Beetle, Hayward discovered what would become crucial evidence in one of America's most notorious criminal cases: handcuffs, an ice pick, a crowbar, a ski mask, and pantyhose with eye holes cut out. The passenger seat had been completely removed, a modification that would make it easier to transport an unconscious victim. Hayward arrested Bundy on suspicion of burglary. He had no idea he'd just apprehended a serial killer responsible for at least a dozen murders across multiple states. Within days, detectives made a crucial connection. Carol Duranch, an 18-year-old woman who'd survived an attempted kidnapping in November 1974, identified the handcuffs as identical to those used in her attack. The young woman described how a man claiming to be a police officer had approached her at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, telling her someone had tried to break into her car. She'd gotten into his vehicle, a tan Volkswagen Beetle. But when he drove away from the police station instead of toward it, she knew something was wrong. He tried to handcuff her, but in his haste, he'd fastened both cuffs to the same wrist. Duranch fought back, managed to open the car door, and escaped by jumping from the moving vehicle. Now, nearly a year later, she stood in a police lineup. She pointed directly at Ted Bundy.
"That's him," she said without hesitation.
Detectives also received a tip that would prove prophetic. Elizabeth Klupfer, Bundy's girlfriend, had called authorities multiple times with her suspicions. She'd seen the composite sketch circulating of a man named Ted, who'd been seen with several missing women. It looked disturbingly like her boyfriend. She'd found medical supplies in their home that made no sense. She'd noticed suspicious behavior, unexplained absences, and strange items in his car.
"I didn't want to believe it," she later wrote, "but I couldn't ignore what I was seeing anymore."
When FBI technicians dismantled Bundy's Volkswagen, they found hair samples matching 3 different victims who'd never met each other, an astronomical coincidence that pointed to only one conclusion. Robert Neal, an FBI lab specialist, testified that such a match would be a coincidence of mind-boggling rarity. It was virtually impossible. In March 1976, Bundy stood trial for the kidnapping of Carol Duranch. He waived his right to a jury trial, believing he could charm the judge. He couldn't. Judge Stuart Hansen Jr. found him guilty and sentenced him to 1 to 15 years in prison. But law enforcement knew they had more than just a kidnapper. Credit card receipts placed Bundy in Colorado at the exact locations where women had vanished. Physical evidence tied him to multiple murder scenes. In October 1976, Colorado authorities charged him with the murder of 23-year-old Corinne Campbell, a nurse who disappeared from a ski resort in Snowmass Village. Colorado prosecutors felt confident. They had their killer. They had evidence. They had a conviction. What they didn't have was an understanding of just how desperate and how cunning Ted Bundy could be.
There was incredible pressure on law enforcement to find the person who was responsible for causing these women to go missing. It was an ultimate challenge.
Thank you very much for calling.
Bundy was extradited to Colorado to stand trial for Campbell's murder. And because he'd enrolled in law school at the University of Utah, albeit briefly and unsuccessfully, he was allowed to act as his own attorney. This seemingly minor procedural decision would prove catastrophic. As his own counsel, Bundy was permitted to visit the law library at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen without leg irons or restraints. During a pre-trial hearing on June 7, 1977, Bundy asked to use the library to research his case. Guards allowed him access, then returned to their duties. Behind a bookcase, shielded from view, Bundy opened a second-story window. He looked down at the ground below, about a 15-foot drop. Without hesitation, he jumped. He landed hard, injuring his right ankle, but adrenaline masked the pain. He shed his outer layer of clothing, limped through downtown Aspen as roadblocks were being set up, then hiked south onto Aspen Mountain. For 2 days, Bundy wandered the wilderness, surviving by breaking into a hunting cabin where he stole food, clothing, and a rifle. He attempted to head toward Crested Butte, but became disoriented in the dense forest, missing trails that would have led him to safety. Desperate and in constant pain from his injured ankle, Bundy made a critical error. Instead of continuing south away from Aspen, he circled back toward the town, right into the path of search parties and roadblocks. On June 13th, just 6 days after his escape, a deputy spotted Bundy attempting to steal a car at the edge of an Aspen golf course. He was cold, sleep-deprived, and limping badly. When officers pulled him over for erratic driving, they had no idea who they'd stopped, until they looked closer. "It's him," one deputy radioed. "We've got Bundy." The media frenzy that followed turned Aspen into a circus. Local establishments sold Bundy burgers and printed novelty t-shirts commemorating the escape. For a brief moment, the college-educated charismatic fugitive became something of a dark folk hero to some, a testament to America's disturbing fascination with charming criminals. But for prosecutors and law enforcement, the escape revealed a terrifying truth. Ted Bundy would stop at nothing to avoid justice, and the case against him, which had seemed so solid, was beginning to show cracks. Evidence was being ruled inadmissible. Witnesses were reconsidering their testimonies. Defense motions were succeeding. Legal experts believed that if Bundy had simply stayed in jail and gone to trial, he might have actually won an acquittal. With only a year or two left on his kidnapping sentence, he could have walked free. Instead, Bundy was already planning his next escape, and this time, he wouldn't stop at the Colorado border. December 30th, 1977, Garfield County Jail, Glenwood Springs, Colorado. While other prisoners enjoyed a holiday with their families and most of the jail staff celebrated with loved ones, Ted Bundy executed a plan months in the making. He'd spent weeks secretly sawing through the steel reinforcing bars in his cell's ceiling, losing 35 pounds so he could squeeze through the opening. Visitors, particularly Carol Ann Boone, a woman who'd become infatuated with him, had smuggled in $500 in cash over 6 months. That night, while other inmates showered, Bundy piled books and files under his blanket to simulate a sleeping body. He climbed through the hole he'd created into the crawl space above, then broke through the ceiling into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was conveniently out for the evening with his wife. Bundy changed into civilian clothes from the jailer's closet, casually walked out the front door, and vanished into the night. Incredibly, the jail's skeleton crew didn't discover the escape until noon the next day, more than 17 hours later. By then, Bundy had stolen a car, driven east. By then, Bundy had stolen a car and driven east into the Florida Panhandle, desperately trying to stay ahead of the law that he knew was closing in. His cash was running out. His overdue rent at the Tallahassee boarding house had made him a target for eviction. The carefully constructed alias of Chris Hagen was unraveling with each stolen credit card transaction he left in his wake. But Ted Bundy couldn't stop himself. Even as he fled westward across the Florida Panhandle, The compulsion that had driven him to kill for years burned inside him. On February 8, 1978, in Lake City, Florida, about 60 miles west of his Tallahassee hideout, Bundy committed what would become his final murder. 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach was a 7th grader at Lake City Junior High School. That Thursday morning, she'd left her homeroom to retrieve a forgotten purse. Witnesses later reported seeing a man matching Bundy's description leading a girl toward a white van in the school parking lot. The girl was crying. Kimberly never returned to class. Subsequently, for 7 agonizing weeks, her family clung to hope while search parties combed through North Florida's dense forests and swamps. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Kimberly had been dead within hours of her abduction. Bundy drove the terrified child to an abandoned pig farrowing shed in Suwannee River State Park, about 35 miles northwest of Lake City. There, in that desolate structure reeking of animal waste and decay, Ted Bundy raped and murdered a 12-year-old girl. He mutilated her body, slashing her throat and genitals with a knife. Then he left her there, partially hidden, to decompose in the Florida heat. It would be his last kill, but not because he'd suddenly developed a conscience or lost his appetite for violence. No. Ted Bundy's reign of terror ended for one simple reason: he got careless. February 15, 1978, just after 1 a.m., a routine patrol near the Alabama state line. Pensacola police officer David Lee was conducting a standard wants and warrants check on vehicles when a tan Volkswagen Beetle caught his attention. Something about the way it moved through the darkness seemed off. When Lee ran the plates, the computer came back with a hit: stolen vehicle. Lee activated his lights and initiated a traffic stop. The driver pulled over without incident. For a moment, it seemed like just another stolen car recovery. Routine paperwork, maybe a scared kid who'd taken his parents' car for a joyride. Then the driver's door opened. Lee approached cautiously, one hand near his service weapon. Before he could issue a command, the suspect, a thin man in his early 30s with dark hair, suddenly kicked Lee's legs out from under him and bolted into the darkness. Lee fired 2 warning shots into the air, then gave chase on foot. The suspect was fast, but Lee was faster. He tackled the fugitive to the ground, and the 2 men struggled violently in the dirt. The suspect fought with desperate strength, clawing at Lee's gun, trying to wrench it from its holster. For several terrifying seconds, Lee feared he was about to be shot with his own weapon. But training and adrenaline prevailed. Lee subdued the suspect and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Only then, breathing hard in the darkness, did he get a good look at the man he'd just captured.
I wish you had killed me,
the suspect said quietly as Lee drove him to jail. The man refused to give his name. He had no identification. Inside the stolen Volkswagen, though, Lee found something far more damning: 3 sets of IDs belonging to female Florida State University students, 21 stolen credit cards, a stolen television set, and a pair of dark-rimmed, non-prescription glasses along with plaid slacks, items that perfectly matched the description of the disguise worn by Richard Burton Fire Department, the fake firefighter who'd attempted to abduct 14-year-old Leslie Parmenter in Jacksonville just days earlier. Local authorities still didn't know who they had in custody. The suspect remained stubbornly silent, refusing even to confirm his name. They booked him as John Doe, fingerprinted him, and locked him in a cell to await identification. It took hours before someone finally made the connection. When Pensacola Police Chief Norman Chapman was informed that they'd arrested one of the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives, he could hardly believe it. Ted Bundy, the charming law student, the escaped murderer, the man who terrorized the Pacific Northwest and now Florida, had been sitting in their holding cell the entire time.
He was very personable, very charismatic, very unalarming, Chapman would later recall. And see, that's the dangerous thing.
Tallahassee detectives arrived within hours, and when they began connecting the evidence found in Bundy's possession to unsolved crimes across Florida, the scope of his recent rampage became horrifyingly clear. The IDs of FSU students tied him to Tallahassee. The credit card receipts placed him in Lake City on the day Kimberly Leach disappeared. Forensic technicians began processing the stolen Volkswagen and found fibers, tiny threads of fabric that would later be matched to clothing Kimberly had been wearing the day she vanished. This time, Ted Bundy wasn't going anywhere. As investigators dug deeper into the Chris Hagen identity Bundy had been living under in Tallahassee, a disturbing picture emerged. His boarding house room near the FSU campus was a spider's web of stolen goods, credit cards belonging to FSU students, clothing and personal items that didn't belong to him, maps of the area with certain locations circled. But the most damning evidence came from the crime scenes themselves. At the Chi Omega sorority house, investigators had collected trace evidence that forensic science in 1978 was only beginning to understand. There were hair samples that didn't belong to any of the victims. Pantyhose fibers found at the scene matched those discovered later in Bundy's car. A mask made from women's stockings with eye holes cut out. And then there was the bite mark on the body of 20-year-old Lisa Levy, one of the two Chi Omega victims who'd been murdered. The medical examiner discovered something unusual: deep, distinct bite marks on her left buttock. The impressions were clear enough that forensic odontologists, dental experts who specialized in bite mark analysis, believed they could use them as evidence. Dr. Richard Souveron, a forensic odontologist, was called in to examine the marks. He took detailed photographs and measurements, then created a transparent overlay of the bite pattern. When Bundy was finally in custody, authorities obtained a court order to make dental impressions of his teeth. The match was stunning. Bundy's teeth were crooked and chipped, distinctive in their irregularity. And when Souveron compared the dental cast to the bite mark on Levy's body, the alignment was nearly perfect. The unique spacing, the chips, the slightly rotated canines, everything lined up.
That's Theodore Robert Bundy's teeth. Souveron would later testify in court,
pointing to enlarged photographs of the bite marks, to a reasonable degree of dental certainty. It was the kind of evidence that juries could understand viscerally, not abstract fiber analysis or complex blood typing, but a literal impression of Bundy's teeth in a murder victim's flesh, a signature he'd left behind in a moment of violent frenzy. Still, the evidence wasn't perfect. Modern forensic scientists would later question the reliability of bite mark testimony, pointing out that human skin is elastic and changes after death, potentially distorting any impressions. But in 1979, it was cutting-edge forensic science. And combined with eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, and Bundy's own suspicious behavior, it painted an undeniable picture of guilt. 7 weeks after Kimberly Leach vanished, her partially mummified remains were discovered in that abandoned pig shed in Suwannee River State Park. The condition of her body confirmed what investigators already suspected: she'd been dead since the day of her abduction. Clothing fibers found on her remains matched those in Bundy's stolen van, fibers with an unusual manufacturing error that made them virtually unique. It was another thread connecting Bundy directly to the crime.
Been a long time, 15 years since the first murder, 10 years since he went to death row. But now it's just hours. Unless there's a last-minute stay, at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning, they'll throw the switch on the electric chair at Florida State Prison, and finally, the tragic, twisted saga of Ted Bundy will be over.
In June 1979, Ted Bundy stood trial in Miami, and America couldn't look away. It was the first nationally televised trial in United States history, and Bundy made the most of every single moment in the spotlight. He grandstanded in court, visibly delighting in cross-examining witnesses from the stand. In his mind, he was a brilliant legal mind, exposing the prosecution's flawed case. In reality, he was alienating the jury with every smug question. But the prosecution had something Bundy couldn't talk his way around: physical evidence. Hair samples found at the crime scenes matched his. Clothing fibers from his jacket. Fibers with a rare manufacturing defect. Eyewitnesses placed him at the scenes. On July 24, 1979, after less than 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Ted Bundy guilty of the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, along with 3 counts of attempted murder and 2 counts of burglary. Judge Edward Cowart imposed 2 death sentences. As Cowart read the verdict, Bundy stood and reportedly shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." But the jury wasn't wrong. Neither were the investigators, the forensic experts, or the witnesses. Ted Bundy had finally run out of places to hide. 6 months later, in January 1980, Bundy stood trial again, this time for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. Unlike the Chi Omega trial, where Bundy had played the role of charming attorney, this time his legal team took control. They knew the evidence was overwhelming. Their only option was an insanity defense.
It didn't work. Eyewitnesses had seen Bundy leading a crying young girl toward a white van outside her school. The clothing fibers were damning. His credit card receipts placed him in Lake City on the day she disappeared. The forensic evidence was airtight. On February 7, 1980, the jury took less than 8 hours to return a guilty verdict. Bundy was sentenced to death for a 3rd time. And in one final bizarre twist during the penalty phase of the trial, Bundy called his girlfriend Carol Ann Boone to the stand as a character witness. Then, while she was testifying, he proposed to her. She accepted, because Florida law recognized a marriage declaration made before a judge as legally binding. Ted Bundy and Carol Ann Boone were, technically, married right there in the courtroom. Boone would later give birth to Bundy's daughter, Rose, in 1982. For years, she insisted on his innocence. But as Bundy's confessions began to pile up in his final years on death row, even Boone couldn't maintain the delusion. She eventually divorced him and disappeared from public life, taking their daughter with her.
It has come down to this. An emergency request to the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution in the case of Theodore Bundy has been rejected this evening. The vote was 5-4. Bundy is scheduled to die in Florida's electric chair tomorrow morning at 7.
For nearly a decade, Ted Bundy sat on death row at Florida State Prison, exhausting every legal appeal available to him. He filed motion after motion, challenging evidence, questioning procedures, and demanding retrials. His attorneys were skilled, and the legal system moved slowly. But time was running out. In the mid-1980s, Bundy began reaching out to investigators with a new strategy: information for time. He offered to confess to unsolved murders in exchange for stays of execution. It was a calculated move. He withheld details, hoping to parlay incomplete confessions into delays.
Detective Robert Keppel from Washington flew to Florida multiple times to interview Bundy. Bundy spoke in chilling detail about his crimes, not just the mechanics, but the psychology.
He described the process of selecting victims, the thrill of the hunt, the manipulation. He admitted to revisiting crime scenes to perform acts on decomposing bodies. He confessed to decapitating victims and keeping their severed heads in his apartment as trophies.
The ultimate possession was, in fact, the taking of the life, Bundy told Keppel, and then the physical possession of the remains.
He also spoke to FBI Special Agent William Hagmeyer, who spent countless hours with Bundy in the final years. Hagmeyer was struck by the deep, almost mystical satisfaction Bundy took in his crimes.
Murder is not just a crime of lust or violence, Hagmeyer later explained. It becomes possession. They are part of you, and the grounds where you kill them become sacred to you.
But even in confession, Bundy was manipulative. He refused to provide complete information, hoping to drag out the appeals process. He hinted at more victims, perhaps dozens more than the 30 he eventually confessed to. Some investigators believe he killed over 100 women. On January 17, 1989, Bundy's final stay of execution was denied. His last-ditch efforts had failed. The state of Florida was ready to carry out its sentence. The day before his execution, Ted Bundy sat down for one final interview with Dr. James Dobson, a Christian evangelical leader and psychologist. In the interview, Bundy made a stunning claim: pornography had driven him to kill.
It happened in stages, gradually, Bundy said. My experience with pornography that deals on a violent level with sexuality is once you become addicted to it, I would keep looking for more potent, more explicit, more graphic kinds of material until you reach a point where the pornography only goes so far, where you begin to wonder if maybe actually doing it would give that which is beyond just reading it or looking at it.
He suggested that law enforcement should stake out adult movie houses and follow patrons as they leave. He claimed that society was doing nothing about the real problem, pornography, and that there were many, many more people who are addicted to pornography who could become killers like him. It was vintage Bundy, deflecting blame, refusing to take responsibility, positioning himself as a victim of external forces rather than the architect of his own depravity. Most biographers and investigators dismissed the pornography claim as one final manipulation, an attempt to cater to Dobson's anti-pornography agenda while shifting blame away from himself. Ann Rule, who knew Bundy personally and wrote extensively about him, called it another Ted Bundy manipulation of our minds. Bundy had blamed everyone and everything over the years: his abusive grandfather, his absent father, his mother for concealing his true parentage, alcohol, the media, violence on television, and now pornography. The one person he never truly blamed was himself.
Guilt doesn't solve anything, really, Bundy once said. It hurts you. I guess I am in the enviable position of not having to deal with guilt.
Ted Bundy's final night on Earth was spent in tears and prayer. Methodist minister Fred Lawrence stayed with him through the night, offering whatever spiritual comfort he could. Bundy's attorney, Jim Coleman, was also present.
At 7:16 this morning, Bundy was indeed executed. The hearse with his remains passed by this street.
Outside Florida State Prison, a carnival atmosphere had erupted. Over 500 people gathered in a field across from the prison, many holding signs that read, "Burn Bundy Burn," and "Tuesday is Friday." Vendors sold commemorative t-shirts. Fraternities set up grills and cooked Bundy burgers. Fireworks lit up the pre-dawn sky. At 7 a.m., guards escorted him to the execution chamber. He was strapped into the electric chair, the same chair that had claimed the lives of so many before him. His eyes scanned the 42 witnesses assembled to watch him die. Superintendent Tom Barton asked if he had any last words. Bundy's voice cracked.
Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends.
The leather hood was placed over his head. The metal contacts were secured. And at 7:06 a.m., 2,000 volts of electricity surged through his body. His hands clenched, his body tensed. Smoke rose from his right leg where the electrode was attached. The current stopped. A doctor stepped forward and checked for vital signs. At 7:16 a.m., Theodore Robert Bundy was pronounced dead. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Ted Bundy had finally been stopped.